Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So regular viewers of my channel will almost certainly know that I am a fan of Forged in Fire. I really love that show, and Lucy and I both watch it actually when, well, pretty much it's one of our go-to programs actually if we want to sit in front of the TV and just stick something on. Sometimes I'll be doing something else, I'll be cleaning a sword, sharpening something, who knows, writing, doing all sorts of stuff, but I like to have Forged in Fire on in the background. I love crafts, so it kind of ticks all the boxes for me because it's got a little bit of, obviously it's about knives and swords and weapons, but also it's about, I like seeing people who are really skilled making things. I like learning stuff about new aspects of technology that I didn't necessarily know about. There are, however, some things with the show that sometimes bug me. Some of the histories of the weapons are less than accurate, which is a little bit disappointing when, generally speaking, this information is pretty easy to find online. And some of the, I mean, I understand it's a mainstream TV show, and I just want to say as well, I think they've done a fantastic job of bringing what's really a very, very fringe interest topic to a mass media, to mass audience, and it's undoubtedly brought huge numbers of people into being interested in knife making and sword making, perhaps even things like HEMA and martial arts, who maybe wouldn't have come into it otherwise. So I mean, I think that's absolutely fantastic, and we have to be under no illusions here. If you're watching this channel, you are probably interested in weapons, history, this type of thing, military history. But you are a tiny minority, and just because you know other people who are interested in that thing, or just because channels like mine or Lindy Beige or Scalagrim or Metatron are popular, relatively speaking, we are, however, very, very fringe. And if you look at Google statistics, for example, through analytics, and you see what people are looking for on the internet, really stuff to do with swords is very, very, very small fringe interest stuff. So I mean, it's absolutely great that they've made this TV show that seems to have mass appeal beyond the group of people it would normally appeal to. But the thing I really want to talk about is edge alignment. Now, I recently did a review for this great book by Mike Edelson, Cutting with the Medieval Sword. And it actually, although it's called Cutting with the Medieval Sword, it's not only about cutting with medieval swords, it's about cutting. Now, one thing we have to recognise is that cutting with different objects is not the same. The way that you strike with an axe is not the way that you strike with a longsword, which is not the same way that you strike with a machete, shall we say, although it's more similar between a longsword and a machete. It's not the same way that you would chop with something like a billhook or a kukri, and indeed the way that you chop with something like a tulwar is different to the way that you would cut with a European sabre, despite the fact they've both got curved blades. Generally speaking, they're used in slightly different ways. And in fact, even the ways of cutting with European sabres were not the same. We read, if we look in 19th century sources, we see there were different ways of cutting even within Europe. So there was a particular style of cutting that was quite popular in Germany, which was quite different to the way that was popular in Britain, and the way that was popular to cut in Britain was influenced by their experiences in India. So there were all sorts of different traditions, even within the same period of time, within a relatively small geographic area. And of course, tulwars, if we go to India, for example, tulwars weren't the only type of sword in India. We also get things like, that's right, in a room surrounded by weapons, things like the pata, or dand pata, as it should be called. And that is a completely different kettle of fish because it's held in a different way. It's a straight blade, blah, blah, blah. So the fact is, we do have to cut differently with different weapons based on the form of that weapon. And sometimes you can have two weapons which are the same, as I've mentioned with European sabres, but are used in a different way. So there isn't always one way to skin a cat. Sometimes there's many ways to skin a cat. I'm not suggesting we go skinning cats here. Okay, now, longswords. It is quite noticeable that in Forged in Fire, the various people who do cutting, I'm not going to name names, and I'm not going to say that people do things, you know, someone is good or bad at a given thing, but it is very clear that some people are better at certain types of cutting than others. And this image which you're now showing on your screen, which shows Doug Marcaida using a two-handed sword, a form of somewhere between a longsword and a greatsword, I would call it. to attempt to cut through a pig, and unfortunately not cutting through a pig. And I have to say, I've seen this a number of times on the show where the test cutting is very inconsistent, and that's, to my mind, for two main reasons. The number one reason is because the person, and it's not always Doug, sometimes someone else, the person doing the cutting might be better with one type of weapon than another. So in Doug's case, it's very clear that he's more comfortable cutting with shorter weapons, things like the traditional Filipino weapons that he spent most of his career training with and teaching. He's more comfortable doing it with those than he is with things like longswords and two-handed swords and spears and axes and stuff. Because, of course, that's what his experience base is in. So, I mean, I would say, I understand that Forged in Fire has to have a certain number of presenters, and they want those presenters to do everything. They're not going to bring in guest experts on the poleaxe or the glaive, although they could do, and that would potentially actually make the show more interesting, I think, but I understand why they might not want to do that. But it is nevertheless a problem if you're testing an object, but no one on the panel is actually really qualified to be testing that object. But I do understand they always say it's not what your thing does to the object, it's what the object does to your thing. That's sometimes when they're testing the strength of it, when they're hitting like a brick or a lump of iron or metal or some brass or something, and seeing what it does to the weapon. So sometimes they're strength testing a thing. That's one completely separate thing, and that is a part of traditional what we'd call test cutting. So very definitely in Japan, in the Middle East, and in Europe. I can cite historical examples of all of those where sometimes they weren't test cutting to test the swordsman or his technique or her technique, but they were using the sword they were doing that in order to test the sword. So sometimes they were just hitting an object to see how hard the sword was. So that's definitely historical, and that's one thing. But when they're using the weapon to cut through a pig, as in this photo's case, then in that case, they're actually testing the effectiveness of the weapon. And so the number one thing is, firstly, the person needs to be at least experienced enough to perform a reliable and consistent cut, or assuming it's a cut and not a thrust, with that weapon. The second point is consistency. Now, sometimes they use machines to deliver a mechanical blow. I'm personally not a huge fan of those, but at the very least, that is consistent. And one of the problems in the testing, when it comes down to one person winning $10,000 and another person not winning $10,000, one of the problems is the inconsistency. And it's very clear that whether it's Doug or whoever else doing the cutting, sometimes they're inconsistent, and it's very unfair. And we all know, those of us who love the show all go onto the forums, well, some of us go onto the forums and have a good old rant about that was really unfair, it was blah blah blah. And it is definitely true that not every cut you perform is 100% the same as the previous cut you performed. So if I perform 3 cuts with this sword and then 3 cuts with a competitor's sword, those 3 cuts have to be as close to each other as possible in order to gauge, okay, which one cuts better. If I do one great cut with this sword and one really crappy cut with the next sword, that's not a test of the swords at all. That's just the fact that I messed up the cut. And I would say there are 2 possible reasons. No, let's say there are 3 possible reasons why this cut, where Doug is, it looks like he's hitting the pig with the flat. There's 3 main reasons why that can occur, okay? So firstly, it's to do with the hilt of the weapon. So we can see in this case that the hilt is pointing the guard. If you look at the cross guard, it should be in line with his forearm and his knuckles here. So you'll see when I'm holding this sword, these knuckles are in line with the cross guard like that, and therefore with the edge. And actually the cross guard on a medieval sword helps you align the edge. It's actually very, very, very stabbing my ceiling. It helps you align the edge, and it's very, very useful, not just in defensive terms, but in terms of edge alignment during a cut. So the three reasons, or the 3 things that can lead to that being misaligned are: number 1, there's some design of the hilt that is making it harder to index the edge and tell which direction the edge is pointing in. One of the things I commonly criticise, as we see on this Burmese dar behind me, are completely cylindrical grips. Not to say that they weren't used, not to say that they're not historical. Some swords and knives historically did have cylindrical grips. I'm not a fan of them for this aforementioned reason, because it makes it harder to align the edge. That's the first thing. The second thing is bad technique. Okay, we have to accept sometimes someone just screws up their technique. It can be to do with the way that they're twisting their hips. It can do, especially with a two-handed weapon, it can be to do with not following through with the foot on that side. The general rule with longswords or two-handed weapons being that if you're striking from the right, you should follow through with the right foot. If you're striking through with the left, it helps to follow through with the left foot. This helps align the weapon, in my opinion. So that's one thing. Can be bad technique for all sorts of reasons. And finally, it can be to do with bluntness, okay? And this is what they focus on in the show. And when someone delivers a duff cut, so a bad cut, sometimes due to poor hilt design, sometimes due to poor technique, they often say, oh, it didn't cut through the target because the edge wasn't sharp enough. And it is absolutely true that if an edge is not sharp enough, this is a sharp edge, you know, that's why I'm being careful. When it hits the target, if it hits completely perpendicular, what can happen is the blade then does this, because you've put energy into that blade, and if that blade suddenly comes to a stop, the energy still wants to carry on moving into the target. And so what will happen is any trailing part of the weapon, so all of the blade behind the point of impact, with a curved sword it's even more accentuated because the curve is even further behind the point of impact, will want to carry on moving forwards. And if there's even 1/2 degree slightly to the left or right at the moment of impact, all of that energy will twist that blade around to that side. Okay, so very commonly when you see it, so that photo of Doug Marcaida apparently hitting the flat of the pig, it is absolutely correct that it could be a blunt portion of the blade, so it's hit with the edge, and then it has rolled round, and that's the point at which that video has been stopped, and so it looks like he's hitting with the flat. He might not be. Okay, so that's why I'm very careful here. I am not accusing out and out, because I can't remember which episode this is from, and I haven't been and watched the video. I can't say categorically that Doug Marcaida hit with the flat. He may have hit with the edge, and then it wrapped flat because it didn't cut through. There are a couple of ways you can avoid that, incidentally. If you hit completely perpendicular like this, that is more likely to happen if there's any issues with sharpness of the blade, or if you meet a substance that's resistant, like leather or clothing, something like a gambeson, this type of thing. Even just thick clothes sometimes can be enough to stop a perpendicular cut. If you have a degree of angle on the blade with the point of impact, you're going to have a drawing effect, or indeed if you do a push cut. So if you have a push or a pull on the blade, it's less likely to flip around and hit with the flat like this. It's more likely to slice through, in my opinion. So, to sum up, there are many ways, many reasons why people sometimes essentially end up hitting an object with a flat. Swords are cutting weapons. They're designed to cut with the edge. As you will see, this is being careful against, this is a sharp weapon. They do not have very much bludgeoning or percussive effect at all. The whole point of swords, at least Western swords, flex like a spring. So if you hit someone with a flat, all you're doing is hitting them with the flat side of a spring. It's not going to do very much damage at all. You give them a bruise at worst, and possibly even less than that. Certainly through clothing, probably almost nothing. Remember, of course, that in historical fencing and other forms of martial art where we use bladed weapons, we use blunt ones, but we're hitting each other with real weight, essentially real non-sharp swords. Okay, and what's the worst that we get is bruises, essentially, through our equipment. Very occasionally you get a broken finger or something, but generally speaking, bruises. So the fact is that a sword swung as hard as you can at most is going to concuss someone through a fencing helmet or break a finger. Okay, but generally it's a light bruise or nothing. They are not good bludgeoning weapons. If we were hitting each other with maces or blunt axes, then we'd be going to the emergency room on a weekly basis. Okay, so we don't do that. But swords are not very good percussive weapons. So there we go. So Forged in Fire, I love it as a show. I think there's a flaw in their methodology for testing the sharpness and the effectiveness of certain weapons, and that flaw comes down to sometimes not the right person using that weapon and not being familiar with that weapon. Sometimes they don't have a person on their panel who is sufficiently experienced with that weapon, and sometimes it's simply a matter of doing the thing in the wrong way and being inconsistent. So even when it can be someone who's skilled with that weapon or someone who's not skilled with that weapon, but sometimes they can do a good cut with one person's object and then a bad cut with another person's object, and that's really, really unfair. They could, solutions, I always like to, rather than just criticise, suggest a possible solution. They could simply have more dead pigs. And I know those of you out there who don't agree with the use of dead animals for testing these things, yeah, they could do tatami mats or something else, certainly. But whatever they cut, rather than just doing one cut with one person's sword and then one cut with another person's sword, really they should do the same thing 3 times, and that would average out the errors. Okay, so if we had 3 tatami mats and I'll just do an oberhau with the longsword 3 times, so this one, then take the other person's longsword and do 3 with this one, that would be more informative. I understand it would take more time, but with editing you could cut it down, and yeah, that would be a more fair test. So there we go. There's a few random unscripted thoughts on Forged in Fire and cutting with various weapons. I hope that's been somewhat interesting. And once again, I do recommend Mike Edelson's book, Cutting with the Medieval Sword. Doesn't only apply to medieval swords, applies to all bladed weapons. Cheers folks, see you for the next video. Thanks for watching, please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.